Picture this. It's a Tuesday morning. An H-1B engineer walks into work like any other day, and by lunch, HR calls her into a room and tells her she's laid off, effective immediately. Right now, in August 2026, she still has 60 days. 60 days to find a new employer willing to sponsor her, or change her status, or pack up her entire life and leave the country in an orderly way. Under a new rule sitting on a desk in Washington right now, that 60-day window could disappear completely. Not shortened. Gone. And she could become unlawfully present in this country the same afternoon she gets laid off. If you're on an H-1B, an L-1, an O-1, or you know someone who is, I need you to understand exactly what's happening right now, because this isn't a rumor, and it isn't finalized yet either. Both of those things are true at the same time, and the difference matters enormously for what you do next. Here's exactly where this stands as of this week. On August 6, 2026, the Department of Homeland Security sent a proposed rule to the White House's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs for review. It's officially titled Eliminating the Discretionary 60-Day Grace Period, and it carries the regulation number RIN 1615-AD22. The actual text of the rule isn't public yet. It's still sitting inside the White House review process, the step that happens before something even gets published for public comment. So right now, today, the existing 60-day grace period is still legally in effect for every eligible worker. Nothing has changed yet. But the direction this is heading in is completely unambiguous. Let's talk about what that 60-day window actually does, because it's easy to take for granted until you realize what happens without it. Since 2017, under federal regulation 8 CFR 214.1, workers on H-1B, H-1B1, L-1, O-1, TN, E-1, E-2, and E-3 visas have had up to 60 consecutive days after their employment ends, or until their authorized period expires, whichever comes first, to either find a new sponsoring employer, change their immigration status, or wrap up their life here and leave in an orderly, legal way. It's not a loophole. It's not a favor. It's the buffer between I lost my job and I am now breaking immigration law through absolutely no fault of my own. Here's the part that should genuinely worry you if this affects you directly. Ana Gabriela Urizar, an immigration attorney at Manifest Law, put it plainly. Removing this grace period would mean an immediate loss of legal status for anyone hit by a layoff. She pointed out something worth sitting with. These are people with mortgages, leases, car payments, kids enrolled in school. A sudden termination doesn't just end a paycheck. It can end a family's entire footing in the country overnight, with zero transition time built in at all. Quick pause here, because if this genuinely affects you or someone in your life, go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're going to track exactly what happens once this rule clears White House review. Now, let's talk about who this actually hits hardest, because the numbers here are stark. Indian nationals accounted for roughly 71% of all approved H-1B petitions in fiscal year 2024. That's not a footnote. That's the overwhelming majority of the entire program, meaning this proposal, if finalized, would fall disproportionately on Indian professionals working in tech, engineering, and healthcare across the country. Ajay Bhutoria, a former advisor to the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, didn't hold back in his reaction. I strongly condemn and slam this proposed DHS policy, he said. Eliminating the 60-day grace period is inhumane and unworkable. He went further, describing exactly what a zero-day window would actually look like for real families. People will not even have time to sell their homes, manage their leases, or transition their children out of schools. And here's a detail that adds real weight to his objection. Bhutoria isn't speaking from the outside on this one. Back when he served on that same White House commission, he personally authored and pushed through a formal recommendation urging DHS to extend the grace period, not shrink it, from 60 days all the way up to 180. His reasoning then is the same reasoning he's using now. Hiring for specialized technology and engineering roles typically involves 4 to 5 rounds of interviews, background checks, and layers of USCIS paperwork that simply cannot be compressed into a rigid, short window, let alone completed overnight. He's now urging DHS and the administration to withdraw this proposal entirely, and specifically calling on South Asian community organizations, business leaders, and advocacy groups to start preparing formal comments now in case the rule gets published to the Federal Register for public input. Here's something else worth knowing, because this isn't happening in isolation. On August 10th, the same general window as this grace period news, the government separately announced it will begin charging new $4,000 fees for certain H-1B extensions and $4,500 fees for certain L-1 extensions. So you have two things landing at almost the exact same time. A proposal that could strip away the safety net workers rely on after a layoff, and a new financial cost layered on top of extending status in the first place. Neither one alone tells the whole story. Together, they point toward a program that's getting more expensive to stay inside of, and more punishing to lose your footing in, at the very same moment. So, what should you actually do with this right now, before anything is finalized? Start with the obvious one. Nothing has changed yet. The 60-day grace period is still fully in effect as of this video, so this isn't the moment for a panicked, drastic decision based on a proposal still sitting in White House review. But it is the moment to get your own paperwork in order. If you're currently employed on one of these visa categories, treat this as your cue to have your immigration documents organized and current, not because anything is wrong today, but because if this rule does eventually take effect, the gap between employed and unlawfully present could shrink to zero with essentially no warning attached. If you're an employer who regularly sponsors these visa categories, this is also worth thinking through now rather than later. How would a layoff or termination actually get handled if that buffer period simply disappeared? The operational reality of offboarding a foreign worker changes completely without it. And if this rule eventually does get published for public comment, submitting a real, substantive comment is one of the only concrete ways your voice becomes part of the official record before any final decision gets made. So it's worth having that ready to go rather than scrambling once the window opens. Here's the bigger picture worth sitting with tonight. A 60-day grace period sounds like a small technical detail buried in immigration regulation, right up until it's the only thing standing between someone building a real, rooted life in this country and suddenly having no legal ground to stand on at all. This proposal is not final. It could be withdrawn, revised, or delayed indefinitely inside the regulatory process. But it's also not a rumor, and it's moving through real channels in Washington right now, which means the smartest thing anyone affected can do is understand exactly where it stands today, rather than either panicking over what hasn't happened yet or assuming it never will. Before you go, make sure you've hit subscribe and turned on notifications, because we're going to keep tracking this rule closely, whether it clears White House review, whether it gets published for public comment, and whether the pressure from advocacy groups actually shapes what the final version looks like. If this video helped you understand something that could genuinely affect you or someone you love, share it with them. Because right now, the difference between being caught off guard and being ready might come down to exactly how much notice this rule ends up giving anyone at all. Thanks so much for watching. Stay informed, stay prepared, and take care.